So I was having a chat with a friend of mine back in 2008, to which we were talking about our respective childhoods, and the topic eventually turned to video games, and he asked me, what was your favorite gaming series from back in your childhood, to which I answered Tomb Raider. And then I don't know why he asked me this, but then he asked me, what was your second favorite? Now you might think that would have been a tough question to answer, but the answer couldn't have been easier for me. Who remembers the Army Men? You know, those little green guys that were so popular back in the 50s and 60s? The guys that you like to smash, rip apart, throw in the microwave. Stuff like that. You know, these guys are so simple, yet so robust at the same time. You could fit them into almost any scenario imaginable, anything you can think of. And if nothing else, as long as you had some form of an imagination, these guys were great by themselves. And then, of course, the Vietnam War rolls around, and these little guys die out due to the anti-war sentiment. Fast forward about 20 years later, into the year 1995, and Toy Story is released. And thanks to good old Ronald Lee Ermey's now infamous soundbite in the film,
"Where is your honor, dirtbag? You are an absolute disgrace! You don't deserve to hate!"
that shot these guys back into the spotlight. And then, of course, somebody got the idea to make a video game out of it. After the demise of the 3DO console and the arrival of much better competitors, 3DO left the console market. Re-emerging in 1996 as a third-party game developer, over the next 7 years they would release a nigh uncountable number of games spanning numerous franchises until their demise in 2003. Among these were Heroes of Might and Magic, High Heat Baseball, Battle Tanks, Meridian 59, one of the first MMORPGs which still survives to this day free of charge no less, and of course, the Army Men series. This is 3DO's most infamous franchise, and probably one of the most infamous franchises in history. Most gamers around my age today, when they think of this series, nothing but negativity comes to mind. In fact, it's generally accepted amongst many gamers today that there is not one good game in this entire collection right here. Some may make an exception for a game or two here and there to an extent, but for the most part, pretty much all gamers think the entire Army Men series is nothing but complete garbage. But is it really that way? Does the series truly, completely, and utterly suck? I say different. I wholeheartedly disagree with the masses. I'm not saying the series is all around fantastic, and trust me, the number of bad games far exceed the number of good games by a long shot. But most people who say this have either had bad childhood memories playing one or two of the most notoriously bad games, or have only seen a little bit of gameplay or read a couple reviews on the games and made their extremely premature judgment based solely on that. Most people don't bother to look at all the underlying facts and information, and I used to be one of those people. But when I actually looked at the underlying facts and information and got whatever I could on the series, a much clearer picture and explanation began to form. Alright, so 3DO was founded in 1991 and went bankrupt in 2003. So, we'll say it was around for 12 years. Now, during those 12 years, they were involved in the creation of 360 games. 360. Be it publishing or developing, they were involved in the creation of 360 games. Now, isolating that a little bit, you can just find my eraser. The Army Men franchise only had about 20 games released during 3DO's time with the franchise, and that's just counting them as standalone titles. You want to add all the various ports for every game released? Let's add about 14 to that, so we have 34 games released during 3DO's time with the franchise. And by the way, this wasn't 34 games released over a period of 12 years. All these 34 games were released over a period of 5 years. The first release was in 1998. So if you want to do the math, just imagine having to release 6 to 7 games every single year, or 1 to 2 games every 2 months, on top of working on at least 4 other major franchises and who knows how many other smaller projects. And by the way, that's spreading all the release dates out evenly, which the release dates were most certainly not. If you want to take a look at their release dates, you'll see little clusters of games released during a very short, intense period of time. Hot damn! No wonder most of these games sucked. I don't even want to begin to imagine what it was like working there. And thankfully, due to an article released by PC World in December of 2011, I don't have to. Now, the article was an interview with a former software engineer named Doug Lanford, who, while he never worked on the Army Men games, he joined 3DO around the time of their inception. Now, the article doesn't offer any direct answers as to what it was like working at 3DO, but it does reveal a little bit of insight, some of which shocked even me. Toward the end of the interviewer asks Lanford this: "Are you surprised to see that the 3DO brand has more or less disappeared into gaming history, as well as several of the properties it released?" To which Lanford replies, "In the early days, I had no clue things would end up in this way. 3DO seemed like a very solid and stable place to work, and it wasn't until the last year and a half that the cracks began to show, though as I mentioned before, nobody was surprised anymore by the end." So he does elaborate on the conditions a little bit, but not in too much detail. I do advise you to go and read the article, though. It's actually a very interesting article. But about halfway through the interviewer just flat out asks Lanford, "What do you think contributed to the downfall of 3DO?" To which he replies, "I can't say for sure, as I had very little view of the business side of the company. I do think that sometimes the company relied too much on deadlines and pushing products up before they could reach their full potential. As such, some of the finished games weren't as good as they could have been. Also, relying on an endless stream of Army Men games likely didn't help." It appears my theory wasn't so far off after all. Now, alright. I'm not saying that this is the exact reason as to why 3DO failed, but if the quality of those games and Lanford's own thoughts are anything to indicate, I'd say this is a pretty darn solid theory. So anyways, I seem to be getting a little sidetracked here. I'm not here to try and go into this big discussion as to why 3DO failed or dismantle their name even further. Trust me, it's already suffered plenty of damage as is. I'm here to refute the belief that there are no good Army Men games out there whatsoever. And if you ask me, there are 6 games in that franchise that I believe are not only worth playing, they're actually good. Now, just for the record, before we begin, these are not going to be full in-depth reviews. This is just going to be me talking about what I like about the games, why I think they're awesome, and why I recommend playing them. I might go a little bit into the design, but not too much. This is just going to be me saying, I think these games are awesome, and here's why I think that way. Now, the first game that I'm going to recommend playing is obviously the very first Army Men game released on the PC on April 30th, 1998. The first reason I recommend playing it is because I believe it to be the textbook definition of a tactical shooter. And you know how so many games, especially released today, have touted themselves to be tactical just because they throw in a couple weak touches of realism, such as a cover system or a 2-weapon rule, and they claim that it really makes you think, when half the time the health system is regenerating health, and the other half, all the weapons pretty much do the exact same thing, with the only real difference being in name only. This game, thankfully, does not succumb to those same faults. And the first area that gets credit with that is the weapon system. Now, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there are only 3 weapon slots. The top weapon slot is always taken up by your rifle, the second weapon slot is reserved for your secondary weapon, and the third weapon slot is reserved for your special weapon. Special weapons can be considered mines, a minesweeper, or even a medkit. Your secondary weapon slot is obviously for your grenades, your mortars, your bazookas, stuff like that. There is one part of the gameplay, though, that I seriously just need to tilt my head at. Okay, as I said, if you already have a secondary weapon, you can't pick up another secondary weapon. That's all fine and dandy, but let's just say you have some grenades, you only have like 3 grenades left, and you want to pick up some more.
Well, can't carry that. Loaded already.
You can't pick up another one and add those grenades to your inventory. That goes with all weapons, by the way. For the record, I have absolutely no clue as to why this was implemented. I don't know if it was intentionally put in there, or whether it was a programming glitch or something like that. But even going beyond the suspension of disbelief, it still makes no sense whatsoever. Now, unlike most games, even of its time, every weapon in this game is completely different from one another. And what I believe makes a good tactical shooter is a game that requires you to know each weapon's distinct strengths and weaknesses. And that is exactly what this game does. And many times, this is also combined with the game requiring you to survey the territory and plan your attack accordingly, taking into account what weapons you have, if you have any extra men at your side, as well as the number of enemies and any weapons they might carry. This is especially prevalent when you go to attack a tan base in one of the later missions. On top of this, the game also likes to test your reflexes with plenty of close-range gunfights. So by adding all of this up, you could also call the game an action strategy game, but me, I just call it a tactical shooter on account of that's pretty much what you do for the bulk of the game is shoot bad guys, and trust me, you do shoot, melt, and blow up a lot of bad guys. You could say an action strategy game and a tactical shooter are technically the same thing, but me, I say that only applies if you're actually shooting in the game, as in controlling one character and shooting a bunch of bad guys. But that's just me, I don't know what you call it. The game isn't perfect though, there are definitely plenty of things wrong with this game. And the first thing I'm going to point out is the inconsistent difficulty. The game is divided up into 3 separate acts, one in the desert, one in the Alpines, and one in the bayou, or swamps. Each act is divided up into 4 levels, with anywhere from 2 to 4 checkpoints. The problem is that you can't save whenever you want, so if you die, it's all the way back to the last checkpoint, and in terms of length, each checkpoint is very inconsistent with one another. Some checkpoints simply have you run across a couple squares along the map, while other checkpoints have you carry out a full-scale battle that provides many opportunities to be killed. As a matter of fact, one level in the game sends you from carrying out a full bank robbery while every tank and their mother is trying to kill you from all sides, all the way to escorting a half-track all the way through a canyon where even more tanks and mortar launchers await you. And if the half-track dies, guess what? Back to start. And as a result, trial and error is of extreme overabundance in this game. Something a save whenever you want system on top of a checkpoint system could have helped tone down just a little bit. So, speaking from personal experience, I just want to say, if you can't get by this game without using cheats, don't feel ashamed, because I couldn't do it even when I was a kid. Even so, there is also a positive side to this. You could argue that the game emphasizes long-term planning and being able to think quickly on the fly, which the game most certainly does. And I don't know about you, but overall, I actually really appreciate that in this case. Because unlike most games that just blatantly punish you with crushing trial and error, in this game, most of the time you can trace it back to something you did. I won't deny that the game can get a little too difficult at times, but if you plan accordingly, it is possible to beat this game, even some of the toughest sections out there. And the sense of accomplishment you get when you finally bypass that thing that's been stopping you for months, let's just say you're practically on top of the world at that point. Alright, fast forwarding to February 28th, 1999, this marked a very special day for the Army Men series. It was the first and only time that two games would be released on the same day in the Army Men series, that we would ever get a remake of a previously released game, and the first and only time that we would ever get a direct sequel to the original game. Starting with said sequel, it still maintains the same basic gameplay premise of being an isometric bird's-eye shooter, but the game seems more like a shooter than a strategy now. Character movements are definitely much smoother, more fluid, and both you and the enemies can take an increased amount of punishment. Don't worry, you and your men still have the advantage, and you can play this out strictly like a shooter with zero strategy involved, and prevail 90% of the time. Speaking of which, your squad mates are no longer treated as distractions for the enemy or one-hit kill bullet shields. If you actually take care of your men and don't get them all killed needlessly, you can actually build up a seriously powerful army by the end of the game, because all the men that join you are persistent from mission to mission. And they actually do level up as they survive battle after battle. So we even have some RPG elements going on here. You can now save whenever you want in addition to having a checkpoint system, so 3DO did listen to the criticism of the first game. And surprise, you can now carry up to 6 different weapons.
Grenades.
And yes, you can now pick up a second stash of grenades and add them to your current stash. So you don't have to worry about that limitation anymore. So overall, I'd say with Army Men 2, 3DO definitely tried to appeal to a bigger crowd. The game is considerably easier than the first game. There's a much greater emphasis on shooting than there is on strategy, and none of the old strategy tricks from the first game really work here. And there's some new weapons here and there, and the persistent squad mates across the levels. And I will say that the game is definitely an improvement over the first game in terms of the general gameplay. It's much more consistent with the difficulty this time, and there's even a difficulty option if the game gets too tough for you. And overall, I wouldn't really recommend the first game over the second game or vice versa. It all really depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for more of a tactical strategy-based shooter, then go with the first game. If you're looking for more of a shooter than a strategy game, go with the second game. Army Men 3D is essentially the first game, only in third-person shooter format. It's got the same story, a very similar intro, and you will recognize many of the missions from the PC game. As a matter of fact, some of the missions are straight carbon copies from the PC game, nothing wrong with that. But a couple things have changed. Airstrikes and paratroopers are completely out of the question. The very few missions where you do get squad mates are strictly protection missions, and you can now carry every single gun in the game at the exact same time. But thankfully, 3DO wasn't going soft on us with this release. You are now very, very fragile in this game, as in a single burst of machine gun fire can kill you. The levels can be very long, and there are absolutely no checkpoints in the levels. Still, even at this, the game does retain the same tactical prowess that the PC counterpart did. Many times, you'll even have to utilize the landscape to your advantage in order to kill your enemies. Then there's a couple other cheap tricks you can use to get through the game. The rifle, for one, has an absolutely ridiculous range, like, you can kill your enemies with a rifle before you even get into their field of view. And if all else fails, just strafing side to side shooting like a maniac should work half the time. That does not mean, however, you can break into a room full of enemies and go spraying and praying, because you will get killed. In this game, it's all about utilizing even those tricks correctly in order to survive. And if you do manage to utilize everything correctly, the game can actually be pretty easy. And a whole lot of fun, too. Which, that's what counts in a game, right? Alright, it appears I haven't been completely honest with you all. There was another instance of Army Men on the PC, and that being recreated for the PlayStation 1 as Army Men 3D. That's Army Men World War, only the PlayStation third-person shooter came first, and the isometric PC shooter was next, released on May 30th, 2000. This was the last isometric shooter released in the series. Now, unlike all the other isometric shooters where you play as Sarge, there is no main character in this game. And the good part about this is that you don't need to focus on keeping a single character alive. Any guy can act as the main character. You have full control over them, meaning you can fire their guns, move them around however you want, and you can also equip them with whatever weapons you want. and they will use those weapons if you switch to another guy. They won't go back to their basic rifles. So in this sense, it's kind of like you get to create your own Spec Ops team, because you're always with a squad or a small little battalion at the start of every mission. The gameplay itself is a mixture of the gameplay from the first two games on the PC. It retains the fast-paced gameplay of Army Men 2, but it ups the strategy ante from the first game. As such, the amount of resilience you and your guys have is greatly reduced from Army Men 2. So if you lose one or two guys to carelessness, that's not so bad. But a single mortar shell does have the ability to wipe out your entire squad, and if you lose every guy that's under your control, you will fail the mission. Luckily, there is the difficulty option, the checkpoint system, and the save whenever you want system from the second game implemented in here. The only downside I can really think of to this game, though, is that while you can equip your guys with whatever weapons you want, we are now back to the 3-weapon rule. You have your standard rifle, which can be upgraded. You now have a dedicated slot for grenades, and room for one special weapon. Sadly, the special weapon can be anything, really, including stuff like mortars and bazookas, which were the secondary weapons in the first game. And there's no separate slot for medkits either. That also counts as a special power-up. Would have been nice to have a dedicated slot for at least that, but I guess that's what you can always create a medic in your squad for, right? But you know what, I gotta say, out of all the Army Men isometric shooters out there, I had the most fun with this one. It took all the strengths of all the previous isometric shooters, even Toys in Space, one of the biggest pieces of shit in the series, and put it all into this game. And as you go further in the game, the missions get crazier and crazier. And much like all the previous games I've talked about, it's tons of fun. Alright, next game, Army Men Air Attack, released for the PlayStation 1 and the PC on November 2nd, 1999, and later on the Nintendo 64 as Army Men Air Combat on July 14th, 2000. I don't have anything to say about this game. In fact, there's absolutely nothing to say about this game aside of the fact that it's tons of fun. You got 16 missions, a whole bunch of different guns, my personal favorite being the laser, and a nice variety of creative missions. The game isn't trying to test your tactical prowess or your thinking skills or being able to plan and strategize on the fly. It's just a bunch of good, simple fun. So if you want to go into an area and spray and pray, this is the Army Men game for you. Plus, come on, man, you get to fly a helicopter. Who the hell doesn't want to fly a helicopter blasting bad guys? Alright, last game. Army Men RTS, released on March 27th, 2002 for the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and the PC. You are currently viewing the PlayStation 2 version. This is kind of like the special version, you know. I don't have it for the GameCube, alright, I admit that. And on the PC, it's pretty much, you know, your standard RTS. So if you've played an RTS on the PC, you pretty much know this game, but console goers are in for quite a treat with this game. It was the first and only Army Men game that I believe was not developed by 3DO. Pandemic developed this one, but I'm not sure if 3DO outsourced any of the other games like the smaller handhelds to different developers, but whichever. Any case, yeah, sorry for going a little bootleg on you. I wanted to try something a little different. Then I don't have my headset at the time of me recording this. My Turtle Beach headset broke again. Anyways, what I love about this game is that it has a really good control scheme, first off. You know, there's a lot of people out there who say console RTSs don't work, they are completely unplayable because you don't have a mouse, and really, most of that time people don't just want to take the time to learn something new. That's the case with many, many folks out there. But anyhow, game's a little odd. Now, this is what you do, okay? See the controller right here? Circle button selects a unit. X button, obviously, moves them. Now, if you want to select more than one unit, if you want to select a group of units, you got a group circle. There you go. Now here's the weird thing. Every time you select a new unit, you create a new group, and the way you alternate back and forth between groups is through the triangle button. Sarge is his own group, the commandos here are their own group, the single grunt is his own group, and these three are their own group as well. Now, to add to a group, you hit the square button. So, observe. he is now part of this group again. Sarge, Commandos, Grunts. Pretty cool, eh? But you must be wondering, how well do they work in combat? That's the thing. See, the right analog stick is a very resourceful tool here. Allows you to cycle through targets. See? Now, combat itself, I have to say, this game is actually pretty well balanced. Every unit has its own distinct strengths and weaknesses. And of course, you know, taking a bunch of enemies and just pretty much hurling them at the enemy, that works too. But yeah, I think I'm going to lose one of my guys here. Gotta say though, AI is a bit spotty. I mean, pathfinding can sometimes be an issue, and these guys aren't really that good at defending themselves. It's kind of like they need you to make the initiative pretty much every step of the way. At least that's what I find most of the time. But besides that, I have to say, you know, for a console RTS, this is actually pretty darn handy. And yeah, of course, you know, you can move your camera around by holding down the R2 button. You know, just hit the R2 button, you snap right back. L1 jumps to alerts. So I gotta say, you know, if you're looking for a decent console RTS game, I mean, this game will definitely suit your needs. I mean, it's not a half-bad game. It's actually pretty action-packed. You know, bases are simple enough, upgrades are simple enough. Man, would you shut up? Nobody asked you. You know, it's not exactly that complicated an RTS, but it's definitely got enough tricks up its sleeve to keep you busy for a while. Yeah, sadly there's not much history after that. RTS was the second to last Army Men game released before 3DO went bankrupt. 34 entries. That has now been boosted to 41 ever since other developers have taken over, with games that are surprisingly worse than the majority of the ones 3DO created. I didn't think that was possible. Well, 42 entries if you count Army Men 3, which is on the eve of its beta release. But you know what? The notion that there is not one good game in this entire collection, in this whole collection right here, has got to be one of the most absurd things I've ever heard in my life. I mean, maybe it's just the nostalgia memories or something like that, you know, the memories from when I was a kid that, you know, make me like this series so much. I mean, this game right here, Army Men 3D, is one of my top 5 favorite games of all time. I think there's only 2 other games that I like more than this. But you know what? Honestly, I believe that there is good to be found in this collection. And I really hope you guys see it the same way. Because if you ask me, the Army Men series isn't bad. It's just misunderstood.